Skin Deep, written and narrated by Saffron Bryant. Chapter 14. Ravyn sobbed, her throat raw from hours spent screaming. Every inch of her burned, stinging where Queen Elena had slashed. Cuts ran up her arms and legs, leaving tatters of skin dangling in bloody shreds. Dried blood covered her, creating a stiff layer that tugged at her flesh each time she moved. She pulled her legs up and hugged them close to her chest. The copper tang of blood filled the air, as if she had bathed in it, and the marble floor around her had been dyed red. What remained of her clothing hung in shredded rags from her shoulders, also soaked in blood. Ravyn's face stung with every movement, each expression tugging at torn pieces of flesh and muscle. Even her eyes burned. She kept as still as possible, but she couldn't stop the tears from creating rivulets of pain down her cheeks. "Do you see what they think of you now?" Queen Elena's mocking voice filtered through Ravyn's consciousness as barely a whisper. "I win in a landslide, 98% in my favor." Ravyn drew a ragged breath but didn't reply. The Queen wiped the bloody blade on Ravyn's torn shirt and stepped back. She waved at an escort. "Take her and release her out the front gate. I want everyone to see." Ravyn blinked and looked up through bleary eyes. Her heart clenched. At that moment, all she could think about was getting away, getting free of the Queen. Two escorts grabbed hold of Ravyn's arms and hauled her to her feet. She stumbled forward and would have fallen if they hadn't yanked her back. Her feet scraped along the ground, and her knees shook. Agony coursed through her legs from cuts and bruises, combining into a mangled cloud of pain that filled her head. She barely noticed the castle walls passing by, or the doors. Only the sting of sunlight in her eyes told her she'd reached the outside, but she didn't care. The escort dragged her all the way to the main palace gates where a crowd of people gathered. Desirables stood at the front sneering, while behind them undesirables in masks stood, unreadable. The gates swung open, and the escorts hurled Ravyn through. She staggered and sprawled across the road in front of the gates, the bare cement tearing up what little remained of her skin. The desirables drew back with gasps, pushing to get away from her. "Move aside," a voice bellowed, and the crowd drew back further, creating an alley through the press of bodies. Familiar shapes moved forward through Ravyn's clouded vision. "Look at her! That bitch will pay for what she's done!" Grumpy growled, scooping Ravyn up in his arms. "All in good time," Doc said in a low murmur. "First, we have to get her out of here." Clouds swirled across Ravyn's vision, and her stomach twisted. Grumpy's metal chest gave solid comfort, and she relished in the gentle sway of his footsteps. Exhaustion from her time with the Queen washed over her like a wave, and she drifted into darkness. Ravyn, it's you!" Ravyn's eyes fluttered open and came to rest on a wrinkled face. Atol's bright blue eyes twinkled beneath his furrowed brows. "When I saw what she was doing to you, I thought for sure, you shouldn't have risked yourself to save me." Ravyn blinked and her small bedroom came into focus. Familiar pieces of her childhood crammed together on crooked shelves. She lifted a hand to her aching forehead. Bandages covered most of her arm, and her forehead felt strange, sticky. "You're not supposed to touch that. It's a gel that robot friend of yours found. Supposed to help with the scarring." Ravyn swallowed and nodded. Scars weren't spoken about in polite society. Atol shook his head and enveloped her small hand in both of his. His rough calluses brushed against her skin with the comfort of home. "You shouldn't have tried to save me." Ravyn's lips stretched into a trembling smile. "I had to. I couldn't let her use you like that." Atol's frown deepened. "But what has it cost you?" Ravyn squeezed her eyes shut. "It shouldn't have ended like this. The people were supposed to change. If they just stuck together, voted on something other than looks, we could have changed everything." Atol sighed and his thumb stroked the back of her hand. People are too shallow for that. I've been trying to tell you that since you were just a little thing. You can't change them. It turns out you were right. A single tear dribbled out of the corner of Ravyn's eye. She wanted to wipe it away. She was so sick of crying, but the pain in her arms and body froze her to the bed as well as any rope could have. Atol's grip on her hand tightened. You deserve better. The Queen will pay, one way or another. Ravyn sighed and opened her eyes. I don't think so. I was voted Queen and I still couldn't beat her. She is the fairest of them all, and that's how it's going to stay. Atol stared at her with watery eyes but didn't speak. I don't remember you being so depressing before. Clearly time in the Outers has done you no favours, Jerry said, strolling into the room. Ravyn tried to smile, but it died halfway to her lips. She settled for a grimace. Atol frowned at him. Let the girl be. She's suffered enough. Jerry's twinkling eyes hardened. No, we've all suffered enough. For the first time in history, this kingdom has a chance of changing. We can't lose sight of that. Ravyn snorted. This kingdom will never change. You saw how the masses voted. It's a lost cause. You can't give up now. Don't you see? Ravyn closed her eyes and rolled over, putting her back to Jerry. She pursed her lips and lay still, heart hammering in her chest. A sharp pain burnt the back of her throat from held-back tears. Couldn't they just leave her alone? She'd already sacrificed too much. Let it be, Jerry! Atol stood, his footsteps tapping around Ravyn's bed. I was just... Give her space, that's what she needs. Their footsteps faded away, leaving the room deathly still and silent. Look who's up and about, Doc said as Ravyn entered the kitchen. Grumpy nodded at her before turning back to glaring out the window, while Leaky rushed to her side, leaving a trail of oil across the floor. We need to fix that damn hose, Atol said, standing and swiping at the oil with a blackened cloth. It's staining everything. Ravyn poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the small table, her elbow brushing against Grumpy. I've already tried, it won't stop. Atol frowned and narrowed his eyes at Leaky. Leaky shrugged. It's been like that since I was first made. Atol sighed and tossed the used rag out the door to the workshop. Ravyn sipped her tea. It spread comforting warmth through her body and eased some of the sting that still burned down her throat. Doc had taken most of the bandages off days ago. She'd only peeked into a mirror once since then, and she doubted she'd ever be able to bring herself to do it again. A ragged mess of new scars and cuts covered most of her skin. She looked like a monster from a freak show parade. Any jobs today? She asked. Atol ran a hand through his hair and looked away. Not today. Ravyn placed her mug on the table. It's because of me, isn't it? They don't want their items serviced by a freak. Atol frowned and shook his head. No, I'm sure it's not that. It's been a hectic few weeks. People probably just aren't interested in getting things fixed right now. Ravyn nodded but didn't believe a word of it. 3 dull thuds came from the workshop. See, there's a customer now, Atol said, hurrying away. Ravyn sighed and took another sip of tea. Doc's round eyes studied her from the other side of the table, but he said nothing. Ravyn? A familiar voice squeaked. Ravyn frowned. Dorabella? She turned, and there in the doorway stood Dorabella. Her blonde hair dangled in tight ringlets around her face, and a burgundy dress brushed the floor. A dark frown replaced Dorabella's usually bright expression. Her blue eyes ran over Ravyn's face, and she bit her lip. Ravyn sighed and turned away, hiding her face behind a curtain of black hair. All right, you've seen for yourself. Now go and tell all your friends. Timid footsteps tapped across the floor, and a warm hand landed on Ravyn's shoulder. Dorabella bent down and engulfed Ravyn in a tight hug. What are you talking about, you silly pumpkin? Ravyn's mouth hung open, and only Grumpy's quick hands stopped her from dropping her tea all over the floor. Her heart fluttered in her chest and something else. Hope. I couldn't believe it when I saw what that horrid woman was doing to you, and to think I voted for her in the last election. Dorabella babbled into Ravyn's hair, her arms forming a tight circle. Dorabella drew back. Tears made clear trickles down her cheeks. She pulled a tissue from her sleeve and dabbed at her face, managing not to smudge any of her makeup. I'm sorry I didn't listen sooner. Ravyn shook her head, unable to believe that it was the same Dorabella standing and crying before her. She hadn't seen Dorabella cry in public since they were 11. Dorabella's mother had told her that no ladies of the court ever cried, and with that, the tears had stopped. Yes, I know, I was an idiot and a fool, and I should always listen to you, but I'm here now. How can I help with the rebellion? Ravyn gaped and looked around the room, but the others studiously avoided her gaze. Rebellion? Dorabella, there is no rebellion. She's won. Dorabella stood to her full height and put her hands on her hips. Excuse me? I risk my mother's wrath and traipse all the way into the undesirable district, and you tell me you've given up? Heat crept up Ravyn's cheeks. Even after everything, Dorabella still managed to make her feel small. You saw the votes, Dorabella. They don't want me. They want beauty. Dorabella rolled her eyes. Is that what you saw? Because I saw that 2% of the desirables want change. Add to that all the undesirables who aren't allowed to vote, and over 70% of the population want you. Ravyn's mouth hung open. She'd almost forgotten that under the makeup and fancy dresses, Dorabella was clever. She often hid it because, according to her mother, no lady got to the court by being smart. But Dorabella arched an intimidating eyebrow. Well? Ravyn's gaze fell back to the table. Dorabella was right. The whole system was rigged against her. If only pretty people could vote, then of course nothing would change. And yet 2% had voted for her. 2% believed the system was wrong. She straightened her back and took a deep breath. Do we still have weapons caches around the city? Grumpy perked up and swiveled away from the window. Yes, scattered throughout the district. And will people follow if I lead? Doc stood, smiling. Of course. Ravyn swallowed and wiped her hands on her worn pants. Then let's start a war. Dorabella squealed and engulfed Ravyn in another suffocating hug. Where will I be fighting? Can it be next to you? She spoke like she was arranging a seating plan, not a fight to the death. Ravyn frowned. Dorabella, I don't know if you should. Don't you start with me! Colour flushed across Dorabella's cheeks. I'm fighting, and that's that. Ravyn grabbed Dorabella's hand. Of course, I just think you might be more useful in a different battlefield. Dorabella's brow creased. What do you mean? The 2%. Do you know who they were? Dorabella bit her lip. Some of them, but not all. Most won't dare admit that they voted against Queen Elena, knowing what she's capable of. Ravyn nodded. I need you to find as many as you can and warn them. They need to stay out of the way, and if they really meant what they voted for, then they should join us. Stand with the undesirables and fight. Dorabella twirled a finger through her golden hair. I'll be able to get some. Maybe they can pass the message on. Good. Before daybreak, 2 days from now, we'll attack. Dorabella stepped back and straightened her dress. I'll make sure they're ready. Ravyn stood. Make sure you only tell those you trust. The Queen can't know we're coming. After so many years training for court, I can spot a liar from a mile off. Dorabella's mouth twitched as she reached the door. Ravyn chuckled, the motion strange in her raw throat. Stay safe. And you. Dorabella turned and bounced out of the house. Ravyn let out a slow breath of air and turned to the others. Well, Grumpy clapped her on the back. The force of his palm sent her stumbling and she had to grab the table for support. It's time to fight, he bellowed. Doc smiled and patted Ravyn's shoulder. This time. She nodded. Leaky, send word out to the Undesirables. Tell them they don't have to fight, but if they want change, they should. We need to get as many supporters as possible. Leaky rushed out of the house in a splash of oil. Atol's mouth formed a thin line and his bushy eyebrows creased together. Ravyn, I know you want to change things. I don't just want to, I have to. Atol whipped his head to the side, sending grey tendrils of hair flicking through the air. No, you don't. There are many others that are willing to fight. I think you've done enough. Ravyn sighed and sank back into her chair. I can't ask them to fight if I'm not willing to do it myself. The Undesirables have already suffered too much. Someone has to stand up for them, and it turns out I'm that someone. Atol rubbed his hands together and stared at the floor, lips quivering. What if something happens to you? You know your dad would never forgive me if something... Shh. Ravyn laid a hand on his arm. Nothing's going to happen. The Undesirables far outnumber the Queen's escort and any supporters she'll be able to muster. The castle is as good as ours. Atol sighed and hung his head. He didn't look convinced. End chapter. Be sure to like and subscribe so you'll know when the next chapter is released.